The Desert and the Stars by Keith Laumer. Narrated by William Skye. This story is brought to you by my Patreon backers, notably Kim Harris. Thank you so much for your continued support. The Aga Khaga wanted peace, a piece of everything in sight. Part 1. I'm not at all sure, Undersecretary Sternwheeler said, that I fully understand the necessity for your, absenting yourself from your post of duty, Mr. Retief. Surely this matter could have been dealt with in the usual way, assuming any action is necessary. I had a sharp attack of writer's cramp, Mr. Secretary, Retief said, so I thought I'd better come along in person just to be sure I was positive of making my point. Hey? Why, there were a number of dispatches, Deputy Undersecretary Magnan put in. Unfortunately, this being end of the fiscal year time, we found ourselves quite inundated with reports. Reports. Not criticising the reporting system, are you, Mr. Magnan? The Undersecretary barked. Gracious, no, Magnan said. I love reports. It seems nobody's told the Aga Khagans about fiscal years, Retief said. They're going right ahead with their program of land grabbing on Flam. So far I've persuaded the boyars that this is a matter for the Corps and not to take matters into their own hands. The Undersecretary nodded. Quite right. Carry on along the same lines. Now, if there's nothing further... Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Magnan said, rising. We certainly appreciate your guidance. There is a little something further, said Retief, sitting solidly in his chair. What's the Corps going to do about the Aga Khagans? The Undersecretary turned a liverish eye on Retief. As Minister to Flam, you should know that the function of a diplomatic representative is merely to, what shall I say, string them along, Magnan suggested. An unfortunate choice of phrase, the Undersecretary said. However, it embodies certain realities of galactic politics. The Corps must concern itself with matters of broad policy. 60 years ago, the Corps was encouraging the boyars to settle Flam, Retief said. They were assured of Corps support. I don't think you'll find that in writing, said the Undersecretary blandly. In any event, that was 60 years ago. At that time, a foothold against neo-concordiatist elements was deemed desirable. Now the situation has changed. The boyars have spent 60 years terraforming Flam, Retief said. They've cleared jungle, descummed the seas, irrigated deserts, set out forests. They've just about reached the point where they can begin to enjoy it. The Aga Khagans have picked this as a good time to move in. They've landed 30 detachments of fishermen, complete with armoured trawlers mounting 40mm infinite repeaters, and another 24 parties of homesteaders, all male and toting rocket launchers. Surely there's land enough on the world to afford space to both groups, the Undersecretary said. A spirit of cooperation. The boyars needed some cooperation 60 years ago, Retief said. They tried to get the Aga Khagans to join in and help them beat back some of the saurian wildlife that liked to graze on people. The Corps didn't like the idea. They wanted to see an undisputed anti-concordiatist enclave. The Aga Khagans didn't want to play either. But now that the world is tamed, they're moving in. The exigencies of diplomacy require a flexible policy. I want a firm assurance of Corps support to take back to Flam, Retief said. The boyars are a little naive. They don't understand diplomatic triple-speak. They just want to hold on to the homes they've made out of a wasteland. I'm warning you, Retief, the Undersecretary snapped, leaning forward, wattles quivering. Corps policy with regard to Flam includes no inflammatory actions based on outmoded concepts. The boyars will have to accommodate themselves to the situation. That's what I'm afraid of, Retief said. They're not going to sit still and watch it happen. If I don't take back concrete evidence of Corps backing, we're going to have a nice hot little shooting war on our hands. The Undersecretary pushed out his lips and drummed his fingers on the desk. Confounded hotheads, he muttered. Very well, Retief. I'll go along to the extent of a note, but positively no further. A note? I was thinking of something more like a squadron of core peace enforcers running through a few routine maneuvers off Flam. Out of the question. A stiffly worded protest note is the best I can do. That's final. Back in the corridor, Magnan turned to Retief. When will you learn not to argue with undersecretaries? One would think you actively disliked the idea of ever receiving a promotion. I was astonished at the undersecretary's restraint. Frankly, I was stunned when he actually agreed to a note. I, of course, will have to draft it. Magnan pulled at his lower lip thoughtfully. Now, I wonder, should I view with deep concern an act of open aggression, or merely point out an apparent violation of technicalities? Don't bother, Retief said. I have a draft all ready to go. But how? I had a feeling I'd get paper instead of action, Retief said. I thought I'd save a little time all around. At times your cynicism borders on impudence. At other times it borders on disgust. Now, if you'll run the note through for signature, I'll try to catch the 6 o'clock shuttle. Leaving so soon? There's an important reception tonight. Some of our biggest names will be there. An excellent opportunity for you to join in the diplomatic give and take. No, thanks. I want to get back to Flam and join in something mild, like a dinosaur hunt. When you get there, said Magnan, I hope you'll make it quite clear that this matter is to be settled without violence. Don't worry, I'll keep the peace if I have to start a war to do it. On the broad veranda at Government House, Retief settled himself comfortably in a lounge chair. He accepted a tall glass from a white-jacketed waiter and regarded the flamboyant Flam sunset, a gorgeous blaze of vermilion and purple that reflected from a still lake, tinged the broad lawn with colour, silhouetted tall poplars among flower beds. You've done great things here in 60 years, George, said Retief. Not that natural geological processes wouldn't have produced the same results given a couple of 100 million years. Don't belabor the point, the Boyar chef de regime said, since we seem to be on the verge of losing it. You're forgetting the note. A note? Georges said, waving his cigar. What the purple polluted hell is a note supposed to do? I've got Aga Khagan claim jumpers camped in the middle of what used to be a fine stand of barley, cooking sheep's brains over dung fires not 10 miles from Government House, and upwind at that. Say, if that's the same barley you distill your whiskey from, I'd call that a first-class atrocity. Retief, on your say-so, I've kept my boys on a short leash. They've put up with plenty. Last week, while you were away, these barbarians sailed that flotilla of armor-plated junks right through the middle of one of our best oyster-breeding beds. It was all I could do to keep a bunch of our men from going out in private helis and blasting 'em out of the water. That wouldn't have been good for the oysters either. That's what I told 'em. I also said you'd be back here in a few days with something from Core HQ. When I tell 'em all we've got is a piece of paper, that'll be the end. There's a strong vigilante organization here that's been outfitting for the last 4 weeks. If I hadn't held them back with assurances that the CDT would step in and take care of this invasion, they would have hit them before now. That would have been a mistake, said Retief. The Aga Khagans are tough customers. They're active on 6 worlds at the moment. They've been building up for this push for the last 5 years. A show of resistance by you boyars without core backing would be an invitation to slaughter, with the excuse that you started it. So what are we going to do? Sit here and watch these goat herders take over our farms and fisheries? Those goat herders aren't all they seem. They've got a first-class modern navy. I've seen 'em. They camp in goatskin tents, gallop around on animal back, wear dresses down to their ankles. The goatskin tents are a high polymer plastic made in the same factory that turns out those long-flowing bulletproof robes you mention. The animals are just for show. Back home they use helis and ground cars of the most modern design. The chef de regime chewed his cigar. Why the masquerade? Something to do with internal policies, I suppose. So we sit tight and watch 'em take our world away from us. That's what I get for playing along with you, Retief. We should have clobbered these monkeys as soon as they set foot on our world. Slow down, I haven't finished yet. There's still the note. I've got plenty of paper already, rolls and rolls of it. Give diplomatic processes a chance, said Retief. The note hasn't even been delivered yet. Who knows, we may get surprising results. If you expect me to supply a runner for the purpose, you're out of luck. From what I hear, he's likely to come back with his ears stuffed in his hip pocket. I'll deliver the note personally, Retief said. I could use a couple of escorts, preferably strong-arm lads. The chef de regime frowned, blew out a cloud of smoke. I wasn't kidding about these Aga Khagans, he said. I hear they have some nasty habits. I don't want to see you operated on with the same knives they used to skin out the goats. I'd be against that myself. Still, the mail must go through. Strong-arm lads, eh? What have you got in mind, Retief? A little muscle in the background is an old diplomatic custom, Retief said. The chef de regime stubbed out his cigar thoughtfully. I used to be a pretty fair elbow wrestler myself, he said. Suppose I go along? That, said Retief, should lend just the right note of solidarity to our little delegation. He hitched his chair closer. Now, depending on what we run into, here's how we'll play it. Part 2. 8 miles into the rolling granite hills west of the capital, a black-painted official aircar flying the twin flags of Chief of State and Terrestrial Minister skimmed along a foot above a potholed road. Slumped in the padded seat, the boyar chef de regime waved his cigar glumly at the surrounding hills. 50 years ago this was bare rock, he said. We've bred special strains of bacteria here to break down the formations into soil, and we followed up with a program of broad-spectrum fertilization. We planned to put the whole area into crops by next year. Now it looks like the goats will get it. Will that scrubland support a crop? Retief said, eyeing the lichen-covered knolls. Sure. We start with legumes and follow up with cereals. Wait until you see this next section. It's an old floodplain, came into production 30 years ago. One of our finest. The aircar topped a rise. The chef dropped his cigar and half rose with a hoarse yell. A herd of scraggly goats tossed their heads among a strand of ripe grain. The car pulled to a stop. Retief held the boyar's arm. Keep calm, Georges, he said. Remember, we're on a diplomatic mission. It wouldn't do to come to the conference table smelling of goats. Let me at 'em, Georges roared. I'll throttle 'em with my bare hands. A bearded goat eyed the boyar chef sardonically, jaw working. Look at that long-nosed son. The goat gave a derisive bleat and took another mouthful of ripe grain. Did you see that? Georges yelled. They've trained the son of a... Chin up, Georges, Retief said. We'll take up the goat problem along with the rest. I'll murder 'em. Hold it, Georges. Look over there. 100 yards away, a trio of brown-cloaked horsemen topped a rise, paused dramatically against the cloudless pale sky, then galloped down the slope toward the car, rifles bobbing at their backs, cloaks billowing out behind. Side by side they rode, through the brown golden grain, cutting 3 narrow swaths that ran in a straight sweep from the ridge to the aircar where Retief and the chef de regime hovered, waiting. Georges scrambled for the side of the car. Just wait till I get my hands on him. Retief pulled him back. Sit tight and look pleased, Georges. Never give the opposition a hint of your true feelings. Pretend you're a goat lover, and hand me one of your cigars. The 3 horsemen pulled up in a churn of chaff and a clatter of pebbles. Georges coughed, batting a hand at the settling dust. Retief peeled the cigar unhurriedly, sniffed at it and thumbed it alight. He drew at it, puffed out a cloud of smoke, and glanced casually at the trio of Aga Khagan cavaliers. Peace be with you, he intoned in accent-free Khagan. May your shadows never grow less. The leader of the 3, a hawk-faced man with a heavy beard, unlimbered his rifle. He fingered it, frowning ferociously. Have no fear, Retief said, smiling graciously. He who comes as a guest enjoys perfect safety." A smooth-faced member of the threesome barked an oath and levelled his rifle at Retief. "Youth is the steed of folly," Retief said. "Take care that the beardless one does not disgrace his house." The leader whirled on the youth and snarled an order. He lowered the rifle, muttering. Blackbeard turned back to Retief. "Begone, interlopers," he said. "You disturb the goats." "Provision is not taken to the houses of the generous," Retief said. "May the creatures dine well ere they move on." "Ha! The goats of the Aga graze on the lands of the Aga." The leader edged his horse close, eyed Retief fiercely. "We welcome no intruders on our lands." "To praise a man for what he does not possess is to make him appear foolish," Retief said. "These are the lands of the boyars. But enough of these pleasantries. We seek audience with your ruler." "You may address me as Exalted One," the leader said. "Now dismount from that steed of Shaitan." "It is written, if you need anything from a dog, call him Sir," Retief said. "I must decline to impute canine ancestry to a guest. Now you may conduct us to your headquarters." "Enough of your insolence!" The bearded man cocked his rifle. "I could blow your heads off." "The hen has feathers, but it does not fly," Retief said. "We have asked for escort. A slave must be beaten with a stick. For a free man, a hint is enough." "You mock me, pale one. I warn you." "Only love makes me weep," Retief said. "I laugh at hatred." "Get out of the car!" Retief puffed at his cigar, eyeing the Aga Khagan cheerfully. The youth in the rear moved forward, teeth bared. "Never give in to the fool, lest he say, 'He fears me,'" Retief said. "I cannot restrain my men in the face of your insults," the bearded Aga Khagan roared. "These hens of mine have feathers, and talons as well." "When God would destroy an ant, he gives him wings," Retief said. "Distress in misfortune is another misfortune." The bearded man's face grew purple. Retief dribbled the ash from his cigar over the side of the car. "Now I think we'd better be getting on," he said briskly. "I've enjoyed our chat, but we do have business to attend to." The bearded leader laughed shortly. "Does the condemned man beg for the axe?" he inquired rhetorically. "You shall visit the Aga Khaga then. Move on, and make no attempt to escape, else my gun will speak you a brief farewell." The horsemen glowered, then, at a word from the leader, took positions around the car. Georges started the vehicle forward, following the leading rider. Retief leaned back and let out a long sigh. "That was close," he said. "I was about out of proverbs." "You sound as though you'd brought off a coup," Georges said. "From the expression on the whiskery one's face, we're in for trouble. What was he saying?" "Just a routine exchange of bluffs," Retief said. "Now when we get there, remember to make your flattery sound like insults and your insults sound like flattery, and you'll be all right." "These birds are armed, and they don't like strangers," Georges said. "Maybe I should have boned up on their habits before I joined this expedition." "Just stick to the plan," Retief said. "And remember, a handful of luck is better than a camel load of learning." The aircar followed the escort down a long slope to a dry riverbed and across it, through a barren stretch of shifting sand to a green oasis set with canopies. The armed escort motioned the car to a halt before an immense tent of glistening black. Before the tent, armed men lounged under a pennant bearing a lion couchant in crimson on a field verte. "Get out!" Blackbeard ordered. The guards eyed the visitors, their drawn sabers catching sunlight. Retief and Georges stepped from the car onto rich rugs spread on the grass. They followed the ferocious gesture of the bearded man through the opening into a perfumed interior of luminous shadows. A heavy odor of incense hung in the air, and the strumming of stringed instruments laid a muted pattern of sound behind the decorations of gold and blue, silver and green. At the far end of the room, among a bevy of female slaves, a large and resplendently clad man with blue-black hair and a clean-shaven chin popped a grape into his mouth, He wiped his fingers negligently on a wisp of silk offered by a handmaiden, belched loudly, and looked the callers over. Blackbeard cleared his throat. "Down on your faces in the presence of the Exalted One, the Aga Kaga, ruler of East and West." "Sorry," Retief said firmly. "My hay fever, you know." The reclining giant waved a hand languidly. "Never mind the formalities," he said. "Approach." Retief and Georges crossed the thick rugs. A cold draught blew toward them. The reclining man sneezed violently, wiped his nose on another silken scarf, and held up a hand. "Night and the horses and the desert know me," he said in resonant tones. "Also the sword and the guest and paper and pen." He paused, wrinkled his nose, and sneezed again. "Turn off that damned air conditioner," he snapped. He settled himself and motioned the bearded man to him. The two exchanged muted remarks. Then the bearded man stepped back, ducked his head, and withdrew to the rear. "Excellency," Retief said, "I have the honor to present Monsieur Georges Duraud, chef de régime of the planetary government." "Planetary government?" The Aga Kaga spat grape seeds on the rug. "My men have observed a few squatters along the shore. If they're in distress, I'll see about a distribution of goat meat." "It is the punishment of the envious to grieve at another's plenty," Retief said. "No goat meat will be required." "Ralph told me you talk like a page out of Mustafa ben Abdallah Khatib Jalebi," the Aga Kaga said. "I know a few old sayings myself. For example, a Bedouin is only cheated once." "We have no such intentions, Excellency," Retief said. "Is it not written, 'Have no faith in the prince whose minister cheats you'?" "I've had some unhappy experiences with strangers," the Aga Kaga said. "It is written in the sands that all strangers are kin. Still, he who visits rarely is a welcome guest. Be seated." Part 3. Handmaidens brought cushions, giggled, and fled. Retief and Georges settled themselves comfortably. The Aga Kaga eyed them in silence. "We have come to bear tidings from the Corps Diplomatique Terrestrien," Retief said solemnly. A perfumed slave girl offered grapes. "Modest ignorance is better than boastful knowledge," the Aga Kaga said. "What brings the CDT into the picture?" "The essay of the drunkard will be read in the tavern," Retief said, "whereas the words of kings—" "Very well, I concede the point." The Aga Kaga waved a hand at the serving maids. "Depart, my dears. Attend me later. You too, Ralph. These are mere diplomats. They are men of words, not deeds." The bearded man glared and departed. The girls hurried after him. "Now," the Aga Kaga said, "let's drop the wisdom of the ages and get down to the issues. Not that I don't admire your repertoire of platitudes. How do you remember them all?" "Diplomats and other liars require good memories," said Retief. "But as you point out, small wisdom to small minds. I'm here to effect a settlement of certain differences between yourself and the planetary authorities. I have here a note which I'm conveying on behalf of the Sector Undersecretary. With your permission, I'll read it." "Go ahead." The Aga Kaga kicked a couple of cushions onto the floor, eased a bottle from under the couch, and reached for glasses. "The Undersecretary for Sector Affairs presents his compliments to the Excellency, the Aga Kaga of the Aga Kaga, Primary Potentate, Hereditary Sheikh, Emir of the—" Yes, skip the titles." Retief flipped over 2 pages. "And with reference to the recent relocation of persons under the jurisdiction of His Excellency, has the honor to point out that the territories now under settlement comprise a portion of that area, hereinafter designated as Subsector Alpha, which, under terms of the agreement entered into by His Excellency's predecessor, and as referenced in Sector Ministry's notes numbers G17584657397B and X7584736C1, with particular pertinence to that body designated in the revised Galactic Catalogue 10th edition, as amended Volume 9, Reel 43 as 54 Cygni Alpha, otherwise referred to hereinafter as Flam. "Come to the point," the Aga Khaga cut in. "You're here to lodge a complaint that I'm invading territories to which someone else lays claim, is that it?" He smiled broadly, offered dope sticks, and lit one. "Well, I've been expecting a call. After all, it's what you gentlemen are paid for. Cheers." "Your Excellency has a lucid way of putting things," Retief said. "Call me Stanley," the Aga Khaga said. "The other routine is just to please some of the old fools, I mean the more conservative members of my government. They're still gnawing their beards and kicking themselves because their ancestors dropped science in favor of alchemy and got themselves stranded in a cultural dead end. This charade is supposed to prove they were right all along. However, I've no time to waste in neurotic compensations. I have places to go and deeds to accomplish." "At first glance," Retief said, "it looks as though the places are already occupied and the deeds are illegal." The Aga Khaga guffawed. "For a diplomat you speak plainly, Retief. Have another drink." He poured, eyeing Georges. "What of Monsieur de Rohr? How does he feel about it?" Georges took a thoughtful swallow of whiskey. "Not bad," he said, "but not quite good enough to cover the odor of goats." The Aga Khaga snorted. "I thought the goats were overdoing it a bit myself," he said. "Still, the greybeards insisted, and I need their support." "Also," Georges said distinctly, "I think you're soft. You lie around letting women wait on you while your betters are out doing an honest day's work." The Aga Khaga looked startled. "Soft? I can tie a knot in an iron bar as big as your thumb." He popped a grape into his mouth. "As for the rest, your pious views about the virtues of hard labor are as childish as my advisor's faith in the advantages of primitive plumbing. As for myself, I am a realist. If two monkeys want the same banana, in the end one will have it and the other will cry morality. The days of my years are numbered, praise be to God. While they last, I hope to eat well, hunt well, fight well, and take my share of pleasure. I leave to others the arid satisfactions of self-denial and other perversions." "You admit you're here to grab our land, then," Georges said. "That's the damnedest piece of barefaced aggression—" Ah, the Aga Khaga held up a hand. "Watch your vocabulary, my dear sir. I'm sure that justifiable yearnings for territorial self-realization would be more appropriate to the situation. Or possibly legitimate aspirations for self-determination of formerly exploited peoples might fit the case. Aggression is, by definition, an activity carried on only by those who have inherited the mantle of colonial imperialism." "Imperialism? Why, you Aga Khagans have been the most notorious planet grabbers in sector history. You... "Call me Stanley." The Aga Khaga munched a grape. "I merely face the realities of popular folklore. Let's be pragmatic. It's a matter of historical association. Some people can grab land and pass it off lightly as a moral duty. Others are dubbed imperialist merely for holding on to their own. Unfair, you say? But that's life, my friends, and I shall continue to take every advantage of it." "We'll fight you," Georges bellowed. He took another gulp of whiskey and slammed the glass down. "You won't take this world without a struggle." "Another?" the Aga said, offering the bottle. Georges glowered as his glass was filled. The Aga Khaga held the glass up to the light. "Excellent color, don't you agree?" He turned his eyes on Georges. "It's pointless to resist," he said. "We have you outgunned and outmanned. Your small nation has no chance against us. But we're prepared to be generous. You may continue to occupy such areas as we do not immediately require until such time as you're able to make other arrangements. And by the time we've got a crop growing out of what was bare rock, you'll be ready to move in, the boyar chef de regime snapped. But you'll find that we aren't alone. Quite alone, the Aga said. He nodded sagely. Yes, one need but read the lesson of history. The corps diplomatique will make expostulatory noises, but it will accept the fait accompli. You, my dear sir, are but a very small nibble. We won't make the mistake of excessive greed. We shall inch our way to empire, and those who stand in our way shall be dubbed warmongers. I see you're quite a student of history, Stanley, Retief said. I wonder if you recall the eventual fate of most of the would-be empire nibblers of the past. Ah, but they grew incautious. They went too far, too fast. The confounded impudence, George rasped. Tell us to our face what he has in mind. An ancient and honourable custom from the time of Mein Kampf and the Communist Manifesto through the porcelain wall of Leung. Such declarations have a legendary quality. It's traditional that they're never taken at face value. But always, Retief said, there was a critical point at which the man on horseback could have been pulled from the saddle. Could have been, the Aga Khaga chuckled. He finished the grapes and began peeling an orange. But they never were. Hitler could have been stopped by the Czech Air Force in 1938. Stalin was at the mercy of the primitive atomics of the West in 1946. Leung was grossly overextended at Rangoon. But the onus of that historical role could not be overcome. It has been the fate of your spiritual forebears to carve civilization from the wilderness and then, amid tearing of garments and the heaping of ashes of self-accusation on your own confused heads, to withdraw, leaving the spoils for local political opportunists and mob leaders, clothed in the mystical virtue of native birth. Have a banana. You're stretching your analogy a little too far, Retief said. You're banking on the inaction of the corps. You could be wrong. I shall know when to stop, the Aga Khaga said. Tell me, Stanley, Retief said, rising. Are we quite private here? Yes, perfectly so, the Aga Khaga said. None would dare to intrude in my council. He cocked an eyebrow at Retief. You have a proposal to make in confidence? But what of our dear friend Georges? One would not like to see him disillusioned. Don't worry about Georges. He's a realist like you. He's prepared to deal in facts. Hard facts in this case. The Aga Khaga nodded thoughtfully. What are you getting at? You're basing your plan of action on the certainty that the corps will sit by, wringing its hands, while you embark on a career of planetary piracy. Isn't it the custom? The Aga Khaga smiled complacently. I have news for you, Stanley. In this instance, neck-wringing seems more in order than hand-wringing. The Aga Khaga frowned. Your manner? Never mind our manners, Georges blurted, standing. We don't need any lessons from goat-herding land thieves. The Aga Khaga's face darkened. You dare to speak thus to me, pig of a muck-grubber? With a muffled curse, Georges launched himself at the potentate. The giant rolled aside. He grunted as the boyar's fist thumped in his short ribs, then he chopped down on Georges' neck. The chef de regime slid off onto the floor as the Aga Khaga bounded to his feet, sending fruit and silken cushions flying. I see it now, he hissed. An assassination attempt. He stretched his arms, thick as tree roots, a grizzly in satin robes. Your heads will ring together like gongs before I have done with you. He lunged for Retief. Retief came to his feet, feinted with his left, and planted a short right against the Aga Khaga's jaw with a solid smack. The potentate stumbled, grabbed. Retief slipped aside. The Aga Khaga whirled to face Retief. A slippery diplomat, by all the houris in paradise, he grated, breathing hard. But a fool. True to your medieval code of chivalry, you attacked singly, a blunder I would never have made. And you shall die for your idiocy." He opened his mouth to bellow. "You sure look foolish with your fancy hairdo down in your eyes," Retief said. "The servants will get a big laugh out of it." With a choked yell, the Aga Khaga dived for Retief, missed as he leaped aside. The two went to the mat together and rolled, sending a stool skittering. Grunts and curses echoed as the two big men strained, muscles popping. Retief groped for a scissors hold. The Aga Khaga seized his foot, bit hard. Retief bent nearly double, braced himself, and slammed the potentate against the rug. Dust flew. Then the two were on their feet, circling. "Many times I have longed to broil a diplomat over a slow fire," the Aga Khaga snarled. "Tonight we'll see it come to pass." "I've seen it done often at staff meetings," said Retief. "It seems to have no permanent effect." The Aga Khaga reached for Retief, who feinted left, hammered a right to the chin. The Aga Khaga tottered. Retief measured him, brought up a haymaker. The potentate slammed to the rug, out cold. Georges rolled over, sat up. "Let me at the son of a—" he muttered. "Take over, Georges," Retief said, panting. "Since he's in a mood to negotiate now, we may as well get something accomplished." Georges eyed the fallen ruler, who stirred, groaned lugubriously. "I hope you know what you're doing," Georges said, "but I'm with you in any case." He straddled the prone body, plucked a curved knife from the low table, and prodded the Aga Khaga's Adam's apple. The monarch opened his eyes. "Make one little peep and your windbag will spring a leak," Georges said. "Very few historical figures have accomplished anything important after their throats were cut." "Stanley won't yell," Retief said. "We're not the only ones who are guilty of cultural idiocy. He'd lose-face something awful if he let his followers see him like this." Retief settled himself on a tufted ottoman. "Right, Stanley?" The Aga Khaga snarled. Retief selected a grape and ate it thoughtfully. "These aren't bad, Georges. You might consider taking on a few Aga Khagan vine growers, purely on a yearly contract basis, of course." The Aga Khaga groaned, rolling his eyes. "Well, I believe we're ready to get down to diplomatic proceedings now," Retief said. "Nothing like dealing in an atmosphere of realistic good fellowship. First, of course, there's the matter of the presence of aliens lacking visas." He opened his briefcase, withdrew a heavy sheet of parchment. "I have the document here, drawn up and ready for signature. It provides for the prompt deportation of such persons by corps transport, all expenses to be borne by the Aga Khagan government. That's agreeable, I assume?" Retief looked expectantly at the purple face of the prone potentate. The Aga Khaga grunted a strangled grunt. "Speak up, Stanley," Retief said. "Give him plenty of air, Georges." "Shall I let some in through the side?" "Not yet. I'm sure Stanley wants to be agreeable." The Aga Khaga snarled. "Maybe just a little, then, Georges," Retief said judiciously. Georges jabbed the knife in far enough to draw a bead of blood. The Aga Khaga grunted. "Agreed," he snorted. "By the beard of the prophet, when I get my hands on you—" "Second item, certain fields, fishing grounds, etc. have suffered damage due to the presence of the aforementioned illegal immigrants. Full compensation will be made by the Aga Khagan government. Agreed?" The Aga Khaga drew a breath, tensed himself. Georges jabbed with the knife point. His prisoner relaxed with a groan. "Agreed," he grated. "A vile tactic. You enter my tent under the guise of guests, protected by diplomatic immunity." "I had the impression we were herded in here at sword point," said Retief. "Shall we go on? Now there's the little matter of restitution for violation of sovereignty, reparations for mental anguish, payment for damaged fences, roads, drainage canals, communications, etc., etc. Shall I read them all?" "Wait until the news of this outrage is spread abroad." "They'd never believe it," Retief said. "History would prove it impossible. And on mature consideration, I'm sure you won't want it noised about that you entertained visiting dignitaries flat on your back." "What about the pollution of the atmosphere by goats?" Georges put in. And don't overlook the muddying of streams, the destruction of timber for campfires, and I've covered all that sort of thing under a miscellaneous heading, Retief said. We can fill it in at leisure when we get back. Bandits, the Aga Khaga hissed. Thieves! Dogs of unreliable imperialists! It is disillusioning, I know, Retief said. Still, of such little surprises is history made. Sign here. He held the parchment out and offered a pen. A nice clear signature, please. We wouldn't want any quibbling about the legality of the treaty after conducting the negotiation with such scrupulous regard for the niceties. Niceties? Never in history has such an abomination been perpetrated. Oh, treaties are always worked out this way when it comes right down to it. We've just accelerated the process a little. Now, if you'll just sign like a good fellow, we'll be on our way. Georges will have his work cut out for him planning how to use all this reparations money. The Aga Khaga gnashed his teeth. Georges prodded. The Aga Khaga seized the pen and scrawled his name. Retief signed with a flourish. He tucked the treaty away in his briefcase, took out another. This is just a safe conduct to get us out of the door and into the car, he said. Probably unnecessary, but it won't hurt to have it in case you figure out some way to avoid your obligations as a host. The Aga Khaga signed the document after another prod from Georges. One more paper and I'll be into the jugular, he said. We're all through now, said Retief. Stanley, we're going to have to run now. I'm going to strap up your hands and feet a trifle. It shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes or so to get loose, stick a band-aid on your neck, and my men will cut you down for the rascals you are. By that time we'll be over the hill, Retief continued, at full throttle. We'll be at Government House in an hour, and of course I won't waste any time transmitting the treaty to Sector HQ. And the same concern for face that keeps you from yelling for help will ensure that the details of the negotiation remain our secret. Treaty? That scrap of paper? I confess the Corps is a little sluggish about taking action at times, Retief said, whipping a turn of silken cord around the Aga Khaga's ankles. But once it's got its signatures on a legal treaty, it's extremely stubborn about all parties adhering to the letter. It can't afford to be otherwise, as I'm sure you'll understand. He cinched up the cord, went to work on the hands. The Aga Khaga glared at him balefully. To the pit with the Corps! The ferocity of my revenge! Don't talk nonsense, Stanley. There are several squadrons of peace enforcers cruising in the sector just now. I'm sure you're not ready to make any historical errors by taking them on. Retief finished and stood. Georges, just stuff a scarf in Stanley's mouth. I think he'd prefer to work quietly until he recovers his dignity. Retief buckled his briefcase, selected a large grape, and looked down at the Aga Khaga. Actually, you'll be glad you saw things our way, Stanley, he said. You'll get all the credit for the generous settlement. Of course, it will be a striking precedent for any other negotiations that may become necessary if you get grabby on other worlds in the region. And if your advisors want to know why the sudden change of heart, just tell them you've decided to start from scratch on an unoccupied world. Mention the virtues of thrift and hard work. I'm confident you can find plenty of historical examples to support you. Thanks for the drink, said Georges. Drop in on me at Government House sometime and we'll crack another bottle. And don't feel bad about your projects going awry, Retief said. In the words of the Prophet, stolen goods are never sold at a loss. A remarkable about-face, Retief, Magnan said. Let this be a lesson to you. A stern note of protest can work wonders. A lot depends on the method of delivery, Retief said. Nonsense. I knew all along the Aga Khagans were a reasonable and peace-loving people. One of the advantages of senior rank, of course, is the opportunity to see the big picture. Why, I was saying only this morning, the desk screen broke into life. The mottled jowls of Undersecretary Sternwheeler appeared. Magnan, I've just learned of the Flam affair. Who's responsible? Why, I suppose that I might be said. This is your work, is it? Well, Mr. Retief did play the role of messenger. Don't pass the buck, Magnan. the Undersecretary barked. What the devil went on out there? Just a routine protest note. Everything is quite in order. Bah! Your overzealousness has cost me dear. I was feeding Flam to the Aga Khagans to consolidate our position of moral superiority for use as a lever in a number of important negotiations. Now they've backed out. Aga Khaga emerges from the affair wreathed in virtue. You've destroyed a very pretty finesse in power politics, Mr. Magnan. A year's work down the drain. But I thought... I doubt that, Mr. Magnan. I doubt that very much. The Undersecretary rang off. This is a fine turn of events, Magnan groaned. Retief, you know very well protest notes are merely intended for the historical record. No one ever takes them seriously. You and the Aga Khaga ought to get together, said Retief. He's a great one for citing historical parallels. He's not a bad fellow, as a matter of fact. I have an invitation from him to visit Khaga and go mud-pig hunting. He was so impressed by core methods that he wants to be sure we're on his side next time. Why don't you come along? Perhaps I should cultivate him. A few high-level contacts never do any harm. On the other hand, I understand he lives in a very loose way, feasting and merrymaking. Frivolous in the extreme. No wife, you understand, but hordes of lightly clad women about. And in that connection, the Aga Khagans have some very curious notions as to what constitutes proper hospitality to a guest. Retief rose, pulled on the powder blue cloak and black velvet gauntlets of a career minister. Don't let it worry you, he said. You'll have a great time. And as the Aga Khaga would say, ugliness is the best safeguard of virginity. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the story, hit the like button and subscribe for more every Monday and Friday. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can head to my Patreon at patreon.com/storiesfromthesky_SFF. There you can listen to exclusive novelettes by the likes of Fritz Leiber, Murray Leinster, Paul Anderson and Ray Bradbury, among others. Plus you get ad-free audio and video versions of all stories I narrate. And if you liked this story about Retief, I've got another couple with him as the protagonist, for example, Saline Solution. A link to the video of me narrating that is on screen now.